And it is a segue to a discussion among the commission and everybody here who has any questions or comments. We have spent a lot of time thinking about how we should respond as a commission to the advance notice of proposed rulemaking that's focused on the common rule. I will use ANPRM for short, so now everyone knows what we're talking about there. It is an opportunity. We were asked in the ANPRM to give our advice on this proposed rulemaking, and I've asked Barbara Atkinson on behalf of the subgroup who's been working on developing tentative response. And everything we discuss right now is tentative because we need more time to hear and refine our own responses, to give us an introduction to this subject, which does have to do with pruning and budding. And it probably focuses a little bit more on the pruning, but we're going to, in our report, go beyond that. So, Barbara, would you begin? Thank you.
I would, and I would just have to say my other subcommittee member was Raju, so he may have some comments too. We struggled a little with this because the advance notice, it was actually over the notice period. Mm-hmm. As a commission, we did respond. Our chair and our vice chair did respond, but we will respond here. But we also hope that this will move forward very quickly and the notice will actually appear quickly. So right. Our report it's a little difficult to actually not be out of date by the time our report gets published, if you will.
But the NPRM will have a period and we will be in time for that.
Exactly right. And it is so important that there are some issues that we really felt we had to comment on now. This common rule has really been in place for a long time, and it really, in 1981 was the last time there were substantial updates to it. There have been some other updates in between, but really it's been over 20 years that there have been very few updates. So it really is time to make some substantial changes. The changes that we reviewed, I should first say that we had the opportunity to review the suggestions to the ANPRM from a variety of really important groups. I'd say that AHARP, the Association for Accreditation of Research Protection Programs, made a very strong comment. The Council of Government Relations for Research Universities made one that we reviewed, the AAMC, Association of American Medical Colleges, and then the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protection made a lot of recommendations in response to this too. So we reviewed all of those and either agreed or disagreed with some of them. What we chose to do in our recommendations here for discussion was to mostly comment on the ones that we thought were positive and to say in a few places where we really didn't agree with them. So we came down to 7 recommendations, and I realized in preparing for this that we didn't make a recommendation on harmonization, so I am going to suggest that we make another one. We did discuss it in our discussion in our draft. But what we wanted to be sure we did was really, as the letter did that was prepared, was try to look at the ethical basis as very specifically as we could for each of these things. So I guess I'd say that as first principles, we wanted to be sure that protection of human subjects was really paramount in everything we did. It wasn't just about making things easier for investigators, although that's clearly something that we want to be sure gets done, because in a way that allows for better human subjects activities if things are streamlined. But protection's paramount. That the oversight should be related to the risk of the study. And so that the more minimal the risk, the less oversight, and the more oversight of the higher risk activities could then be an area of concentration. and that harmonization, even though it's going to be very difficult, is probably one of the most important things that needs to be done. So our recommendations, the first one was to reduce the time for duplicative reviews. So really trying to mandate a single IRB review for multi-state studies was suggested. We don't think mandating a single review is the most important thing, but actually doing whatever can be done to encouraging single review. Almost all of the people that commented suggested that it might actually not be helpful to have multiple reviews from each individual site for an individual study, but in fact that having varying degrees of answers to questions in an IRB review might actually be not helpful. So having one IRB is something that could help, but should not be mandated as being the only thing essential. We suggested restructuring of the research oversight to appropriately calibrate the review activities with the level of risk. I mentioned that before, and that came in the suggestions of the ANPRM in 3 different areas. One was that if you really have an exempt list of activities, you should look at what's on an exempt list. What exempt research is things like surveys or could be even expanded to some surveys and some focus groups and some kinds of things that are really have essentially no risk to the subjects being involved in them. That list of exempt activities should be looked at and probably expanded. And then a category of minimal risk activities should should be reviewed. They suggested be reviewed, just be determined, the exempt could be reviewed just by the investigator himself or herself. We really don't think that's appropriate. We really think somebody higher level than that needs to review the exempt research. The minimal and lower risk studies, again, should be reviewed, but only in the beginning. The continuing review for certain of the lower risk studies, minimal risk studies, would not be necessary, so only a single review. And clarifying that routine IRB review of exempt studies in minimal risk and expanded categories really are not necessary. Making the ANPRM suggested templates for the informed consent itself, and we agree that making some standardizations to the consent form and some templates available would create a regulatory safe harbor, and we would hope would discourage the use of indecipherable legal boilerplate language. I love that. But many of the IRBs are very long. The informed consents, are very long, 30 or 40 pages, mostly of things that nobody could begin to understand. Making a standardized consent that's reasonable, that really is aimed for the level of the person who's being consented would be really important. But to just suggest templates, we also don't think is appropriate. There are some things that need to be more than templates. Issuing guidances rather than mandates, we think is important to encourage appropriate informed consent. So guidance was suggested by many of the reviewers. The ANPRM was really more in a mandating mode. We thought they should be more in a guidance mode. And developing flexible guidelines and procedures for informed consent that meet the needs of the scientists who are in areas not of clinical trials per se, but maybe more behavioral and social science areas, more public health areas, and more hospitals doing quality assurance kinds of reviews need to have more flexible guidelines than those that would be used for the traditional clinical trials. And then again, I would just add that we, in our summary, didn't suggest a harmonizing suggestion, but I think we definitely need to do that in our summary, recognizing that it would be difficult, but we need to work to harmonize, both within the United States for all of the agencies and worldwide to the extent that we can. And the harmonization needs to have the ethical basis that we've already been discussing.
Good. That's a quick summary. I'm open to comments, but let's start with Raju, see what Raju wants to add to that.
I just want to add two comments, Barbara. It's really a great summary. I think that all of the different groups that responded to ANPRM, everybody looks at these from their own lenses, and our commission is probably no exception. And the commission looks at these all of the proposals in light of the principles that we have articulated in our SynBio report. And I think that's probably an important component, because we sort of considered the considerations that the commission takes are universal principles that can be applied to any types of research, and that they would also apply here. And so that's a prism that we take. And so that's an important component, and we indeed make such a recommendation at the beginning.
And let me just remind people, commission members know this by heart, but not everybody in the audience may what the principles are, because they really are quite comprehensive. Public beneficence, acting to maximize public benefits and minimize public harm, including the duty to promote activities like scientific research that have great potential to achieve the public's well-being. Responsible stewardship, a shared obligation among members of domestic and global communities to act in ways that demonstrate concern for those who are not in a position to represent themselves. Intellectual freedom and responsibility, encouraging creative potential used in morally accountable ways. Democratic deliberation, reflecting an approach to collaborative decision-making that embraces respectful debate of opposing views and active participation by citizens. And justice and fairness, distributing benefits and burdens across society in a just and fair manner.
The other comment is, another proposed rule is to change the way that we have consent to include, future research. And this is an important issue, and there are several responses to the NPRM that sort of suggested that, that this may be difficult to do, and this might actually reduce the protections for human subjects. But I don't know, Barbara, if you agree, that at least my view about this is that the way that the current regulations are truly hindering our ability to be able to obtain the maximum amount of information from clinical research. And it would be great to be able to find a mechanism without changing the protections to still be able to obtain consent to use the data for other purposes. That also raises another important question that the Commission need to think about, is what about all of the samples that have been collected so far that are in various types of repositories, and they're all also very valuable resources, and we don't have a mechanism to be able to deal with it.
So open for comments. Christine?
Thank you, Barbara and Raju, for working on that section. I had a question primarily about things that we didn't, that the ANPRM mentioned that we didn't say anything about.
Right.
So one of them is the suggestion to have a central database for adverse events and unanticipated problems, and in that way to harmonize the system across the government. It seems compatible with some of the other things that we've recommended in our report. It's also a way to provide information about what's happening to human subjects, or in research. And so I wondered why we didn't say anything about that. And I have just two other that I'll just add on to.
Yeah,
this.
and I think we certainly can in this section. We do in another section of our now ongoing drafting of this.
Yeah.
So we may
you may want to
need some
support it here as well.
We need some cross-referencing.
And I do agree with it.
Okay.
I think it was an oversight on the harmonization. I think we underput
Okay.
in what needed to be here.
Good.
So I do agree.
So then, just 3 other short things.
Just
3.
quickly, 3.
A sort of statement of opposition to mandating single IRB review, I think is one that I personally have a little trouble with. I don't like the word mandate, and I don't think that is what I would recommend either. But regulations have a certain force, and so maybe making the regulation language that's the default, or that should be, I mean, I don't know how you encourage it without allowing, I mean, it's already allowed, but people aren't doing it. So what should we do to recommend that the regulations say something that allow people to do it in ways that they don't feel like they're allowed to now?
Ordinarily, we would expect
Yeah,
a single.
that's the
Ordinarily, we would
Yeah.
expect a single IRB.
But there are exceptions, and there are things that need to be fixed, like liability and things like that you
Yeah, but
pointed out.
don't, you say that very quickly, like liability and things like that. That's a huge issue.
Yeah.
I'm just saying what the group has said, why the group has said this. Until you fix that, to immediately mandate single sites without having prior fixed the issues of liability
So-
is a real, it just,
But why not recommend that the default should be one single IRB, and there should be attention to, resolving the tensions?
And
as-
that's
As opposed to
concerns.
saying, don't you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I just-
but you said recommend rather
Well, that's
than.
what we're doing.
And maybe it is work toward it. I do agree that in the end, we should have one IRB, but we are nowhere even close to being able to solve some of the issues to get there. So there's so much work to be done. So maybe it's somehow phrasing it
Yep.
in do the work to
You're
get there.
making a friendly amendment rather than saying we
Yeah.
should endorse mandating single-site IRBs.
But I think the
immediately.
regulations should make it clear that that's a good idea, and some of these things need to be fixed
Yeah.
up. So the other one is the exempt category.
Yeah,
It seems like our stand on that is, we can't trust the investigator to decide what's
Right.
exempt. And I think the reality is that we already are trusting investigators to decide when to go to the IRB. Exempt, determining what's exempt in different institutions varies from institution to institution. And so, as I understand what's proposed in the ANPRM, it's to have a system of registration so that all investigators doing anything with human subjects or specimens would register. Already, that's a step up from what we're doing now. And a registration system, of course, it would have to be developed, and there are, this will take time and resources, could have an algorithm in there that directs the investigator to either go for further review or not. So, I mean, I think saying that we can't allow, we have to have review for every exemption, which the regulations don't currently require, is a mistake.
Registration will also address our transparency
Sure.
recommendations as well.
Can I
I mean,
Yes,
just
yes,
comment back?
yes, and then Nita.
I guess it must be very institutionally different, but in our place, everybody would have to at least come forward for a review. I mean, registration would be just duplicative of that. Maybe there are places where if you're doing anything with human subjects, you don't have to at least once bring it forward. But I don't think the whole committee needs to review, or even one committee member necessarily, but I think somebody more than a person ought to review any human subjects and put it in some category, somebody who's not the investigator. But it's a personal view, and if the committee feels differently about that, we can go with what the committee feels.
Nita.
So thank you. This is incredibly helpful. I know that these are difficult to go through all of the different recommendations as well. I wanted to build a little bit on Christine's question about the mandating issue versus default. I was a little bit confused by this in the draft, primarily because it's not really spun out to explain what the issues are. So we have kind of a line in the draft right now about enforcement issues, liability issues, and implementation issues. And I know we're piggybacking on comments that have already been made, but I think if we're going to take the position that mandating is not appropriate because of these limitations, then it would be quite helpful to say what the specific limitations that we think are, and then incorporate into the recommendation
Yeah.
that we think we're supportive of a single site IRB.
Right, that's
So
good.
long as the following issues are addressed, and specifically enumerate what those issues are. If those issues are addressed, we would be supportive of a default single IRB
Right.
recommendation.
And that's in the spirit of what's
Yeah,
here, but
I
it
like that.
needs to,
Right.
it needs to be specified. Dan?
In a couple of places in this section and other sections in the report, we use the phrase that we would like to have guidance rather than regulation. And maybe the experience of others around the table is different from mine, but the difficulty becomes once there's federal guidance, it is almost always interpreted locally as regulation is put in to sort of create the kinds of barriers that people complain about. So I wonder whether that really, helps us a lot to say, well, we're just going to say guidance, because as soon as it says we're going to say that these are the things we would suggest you do, then every IRB is going to demand that it be done, and I don't know that it helps very much.
I don't know how to respond. Here, guidance was,
What are we
I think it was mostly about the consent form,
Consent
and
forms
what
is
should
what we
be in
use
different
specifically in
sections of
here, yes.
the consent form.
Yeah, there are other places in the report we use that sort of, we'd rather
Yeah,
guidance than
so
regulation.
in the consent form, I think being able to say, put in X, Y, and Z was the kind of guidance that people wanted, rather than saying, here's a template, just fill in the words, which is almost more prescriptive and less helpful, if you will. But being able to have in general what was in sections, to me, is real guidance and isn't regulation. Maybe it's regulation if you say everything that you put there has to be there, but different kinds of studies. I mean, we're talking about studies now that are so different from 30 years ago that people had never contemplated, the kinds of social studies research or quality assurance research that exists now.
Good, so then maybe just in this section, you would say guidance rather than templates. Is that, if that's the strength
Right.
of what you're saying there, that I think would be valuable, but it will still be, in essence, interpreted as a requirement, and, probably reasonably so
Yeah,
if it's
yeah.
good, if
Yeah.
it's good guidance. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Good. Yes, Anita?
Barbara, I was interested in your discussion about problems with informed consent statements and the inevitable useless legalese boilerplate, I think you put it. Also concerns about overly scientific technicalities. But the problem that I think needs to be equally emphasized is the problem of oversimplification, right? Because I've seen one informed consent statement, for example, aimed at an 18-year-old, in which viral vectors were described as sort of similar to colds and like kind of like a taxi cab that drives the gene therapy.
delivers the thing.
Exactly. So we have to be careful about not making our informed consent statements so dumbed down that they have the unintended consequence of understating the risk involved to the subject. And I wondered if you've given any thought to that problem, that side of the problem.
I don't really know how you address that. I mean, you do want to have,
I was going to say, sort of the usual way to address those issues would be to have a test of understanding that would be culturally consonant with the research populations, and this is something that our own group does overseas all the time, because you have to take difficult concepts, put them into a different language, and you need some assurance back that there is truly have been an understanding what the consent form meant. So, I mean, that's also could be a playground for misadventure, depending on how the test of understanding is done. But there are at least some, I think, procedures you could put in place to recommend those kinds of safeguards.
I hope we'll do that.
Yeah, I would prefer, I think the stricter standard is clarity rather than simplicity. I've seen many forms that even a doctor or, who's not working in that particular field would have a very hard time understanding, because it's not written in as clear a way as possible. And also there's a question of priorities of what I would hope from, and I think we should recommend from the template, is those aspects of risks and benefits that are most salient and most probabilistic should come first, and those risks that are highest, either probabilistically or given the harm that they present, should be presented up front and not down in, page 20 in small print. So I think you're right. I don't think we want to argue for simplicity as in you can understand it if you have a third grade education, but you're not understanding what the real risks and benefits are here. So it's clarity that it's harder to write a clear consent form than it is to write a 40-pager.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
For sure.
Yeah.
Other comments and questions? And again, anyone in our audience who would like to comment, please write it down. Yes. Lonnie, I see you.
Oh, no,
No,
actually,
okay.
Christine, she actually asked, and it was on guidance and mandates, so she actually asked the question for me, so.
Okay.
So could I just ask us to drill down a little on this single site IRB and ask anybody on the commission to comment on what are some of the present risks that need to be dealt with before we feel that it's comfortable for the protection of human subjects to have the choice of one IRB rather than going through multiple IRBs, because I think that's the issue, and I think it's the reasonable issue standing between us and saying one IRB, because one IRB is simpler, it's faster, it's more efficient. Let's hear the buts, because I think we need to put those into our report, because we have to focus on what's going to protect human subjects. So beginning with Nita.
So, again, I'm supportive of us ultimately
Yes,
getting there.
I think
yeah.
we're in concert there.
But one of the first issues is the issue of forum shopping. So you see this in law, of
Yes.
course, where people go from site to site, state to state to find the most favorable laws. Even with a consistent set of guidelines and recommendations, different IRBs handle things differently. And I think we need to make sure that forum shopping, this doesn't encourage forum shopping to go to the kind of the least enforcement, least strict, least oversight. Second, and a major issue, is the issue of liability, which we mentioned but don't elaborate on.
Right.
A single site taking on full liability simply by being the overseeing IRB is problematic if it really is a multi-site project.
And it won't take on.
Right.
De facto, it will not take on sole liability. If multiple sites are engaged in research and somebody wants to sue, they will sue all sites, even if only one IRB agreed.
That's right.
That's just the fact of.
That's right, but then the question is, if there's something, if you have forum shopping where there is an IRB who has more lax standards that other sites have to defer to, and that IRB happens to not, in fact, be up to the same standards as other sites, the liability isn't just that they carry liability, it's that other sites expose themselves to liability by going through that single site, which makes other IRBs potentially resistant, or other institutions resistant to having that site be the site. Now, that might help us with forum shopping, they won't default to it, but these are kind of interrelated issues.
Yeah, let me just read this comment because it's directly on this point. And is it Joan Racklin? Yep. Would you just stand up? Thank you very much for this comment. And I think you have very good handwriting, so I think I will be able to read it. When discussing the issues surrounding a single IRB of record, should the Commission consider making a statement about having the default position be a central or consortium IRB, but not necessarily a commercial one? Given the many concerns about conflicts of interest, inability to adequately consider local subjects' needs, and inability to gauge remotely situated researchers' ability to ethically conduct the research, I would respectfully ask that the Commission consider distinguishing between commercial and academically based review boards. Thanks. Thank you.
I was just going to emphasize one of the points that was just made in that comment, that one of the reasons to have multiple sites is often to try to get different populations, and those different populations may have differences that are sufficient that they make ethical differences, and there ought to be, even if there is a single IRB, some mechanism of getting local input into that central IRB, and I don't think that's been worked out.
And it's interesting to my mind and to the Commission's mind that the ANPRM recommends a single-site IRB only for domestic research, not for international research, which may or may not make sense practically speaking, but it's troubling ethically speaking because there are different communities in the U.S. as there are around the world, and an international project that's in France or Great Britain in an affluent, highly developed infrastructure could be very different and just as protective as a multi-site in the United States that has less infrastructure at some of the sites.
Can I make a clarification?
Sure, please.
I think, I don't know, Dan, you're implying that the way that the current system is, that it is possible to have different levels of IRB approvals. But for multi-sites, there is only one approval, right? And so that's important to recognize that. So
Yes,
basically, all of these changes that individual IRBs they have to be approved by everybody else. And that is the major issue.
No, I'm not disagreeing with trying to streamline that process. All I'm saying is that when it's done, if it's going to be done by a single IRB, we shouldn't lose all of the local inputs that go through this now cumbersome process that we're trying to fix.
Yeah, that's, Christine, I'm going down, and John, and then we're going to adjourn for lunch, but go ahead.
Just two additions to this issue. One is to recognize that, in fact, right now, some multi-center studies are being reviewed by one IRB. So it's not like something that's never been done before.
It's permitted.
It's
now.
permitted.
It's not required.
And it's not required, and it's not even, I don't know if I would even say it's the default, but it is certainly being done more and more as time goes on.
Yeah, it's not the default.
No. Secondly, a lot of people, I do think, pick up on what Dan just said, that there are local issues that need to be considered, and a single IRB can't deal with that. And I think my own view on that is that that's wrong on two counts. One is there are ways to bring local issues to a central place if that was important. But the second thing is, if an IRB reviews a study, I think we all recognize that that doesn't mean all of the ethical obligations are over. You know, everybody involved, including people at the various sites where the study will be conducted, whether or not the IRB was there too, have responsibilities. And one of their discretionary responsibilities is to say, I don't like the way this study is set up, I'm not going to do it here.
Yeah, although the realism of that,
It happens.
it happens.
happens.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does happen.
It does happen.
But there is institutional as well as individual responsibility for activities that go on, and I don't think we want to say that the institutions should, for the same reasons John gave earlier about you need both institutional protection and individual protection, we want to make sure that a single site IRB, that a single IRB really, as you said earlier and Dan suggested, takes into account all of the ethical requirements wherever the research is being conducted. That's going to be really important for protecting human subjects. John?
Well, I'm good. Anita raised all my issues. I'm just discouraged that she raised them better than I would.
I'm going to ask Dr. Atkinson to make the concluding comments, and then we're going to adjourn for lunch and reconvene at 1:30. So, Barbara.
I just wanted to comment on the question from the audience about the
Yeah.
commercial IRBs versus the
Good.
academic ones. And I think there's good data now to show that some of the commercial ones, at least, are very good IRBs and possibly better than some of the academic IRBs. I hate to say that, but I think it's it's probably actually true. So I would hate to make that recommendation here, absolutely. I think the very best IRBs should be whoever certainly would do a multi-site study, and it might or might not be a commercial one.
What we want to ensure is that we have, we put forward a standard that maintains the highest level of protection, and does not, and I think the spirit of what you're saying is don't have foreign shopping for the least strict IRB. And that's in the spirit of the ANPRM, and I think we need to elaborate on that. Thank you all very much, and we will reconvene at 1:30.
Okay.